Hello, I'm Tom Rothman of 20th Century Fox. Welcome to Fox Legacy. We're glad to have you with us.
We danced. That is all. And mark this. Let anyone breathe a word or the edge of a word about the other things. And I will come to you in the black of some terrible night, and I will bring with me a pointy reckoning that will shudder you. And you know I can do it.
Working in the movies, there are a bunch of questions I'm often asked. What's your favorite film? Lawrence of Arabia. What's your favorite Fox film? Well, if you're a regular watcher of Fox Legacy, you know it's Phantom of the Paradise, and you know why. But Master and Commander, All About Eve, and Avatar are in a dead heat right behind. What's the film that changed your life? Easy, Casablanca. But on occasion, I'll get asked, what film is your biggest disappointment? Now that is a tricky question. If by that is meant what film that I had high hopes for turned out badly, there are sadly more than a few of those. But if the question means what film did I work on that I love, that I think is brilliant, indeed a masterpiece, that failed in the marketplace, for that category, there is above all the film treat you are about to enjoy tonight, the 1996 adaptation of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. In my opinion, and the now reconsidered opinion of many of the same critics who dismissed it at the time, one of the finest emotional dramas of the last 20 years. In a corner of my office, hidden behind a few of the many pictures of my kids, is an old framed quote from Teddy Roosevelt. It so happens that at least two great directors I know have at different times produced this very same quote from tattered papers stuffed inside their wallets. At the Sorbonne in 1910, Teddy Roosevelt said the following. He said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit," Teddy said, "belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcomings, but who does actually strive to do the deed, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." Those words comfort many of us, and often in this life. Trust me, no one alive ever set out to make a bad movie. But when you're fortunate enough to make an exceptional film, and the reception from the critics or the public is harsh, Teddy's words are very heartening. Because the reason for rejection can sometimes be well-founded, and then we get what we deserve and we need to do better. But sometimes the reasons are transient and disconnected from the work itself. I believe that's the case with The Crucible, a film which almost no one went to see at the box office. It did barely $7 million in domestic rentals, and which, although more than a few critics called it a masterpiece at the time, and it received 2 Academy Award nominations, the majority of critics dismissed as irrelevant to the times. They thought Arthur Miller himself was passé, and his allegory passé. Not me, baby. I stood up for it then, and I stand up for it now. I think it's great, enduring, emotional drama, all allegory aside. And as to contemporary relevance, I agree with Miller when he said on the eve of its release that he believed in the, quote, applicability of the play to any time, as it doesn't depend on any particular political or sociological development. Miller said he wrote it, quote, blind to the world. I think it's an overlooked jewel, but you watch it tonight and decide what you think. In any event, it certainly provided me with one of the best and most meaningful experiences of my life on the celluloid trail. After the film, we'll talk a little about the usual subjects of allegory and McCarthyism that form the typical high school English class discussions on the Crucible. And I used to be a high school English teacher, so I'll be nostalgic. But before you watch it, I want to tell you a little bit about the exceptional talents who made it happen and commend a particular aspect of the filmmaking to your attention. Now, even by Hollywood standards, 43 years is a long-ass time in development. But that's exactly how long it took the man lionized as the greatest American playwright of the post-war era to get a film made of his classic play. There had been a rather bizarre French version of a movie made in 1957, written by, of all people, Jean-Paul Sartre, which is really weird when you think about it, as the dilemmas presented in the story are dead, real, emotional ones, not remotely existential. But for too many reasons to catalog here, not the least of which was Miller's own deep-seated distrust of the movies as a medium and unhappiness with his own experiences in it. I mean, after all, The Misfits, which he wrote, cost him a divorce with a lady named Marilyn Monroe. The movie never happened. Finally, though, Miller's son, Robert, convinced his father to let him try, and together, with Miller writing the script himself, they persevered. Eventually, the project was taken up and championed by the talented Fox production chief, Tom Jacobson. Tom's belief in the material endured through many ups and downs until the elements coalesced just so. The movie was based on a play, obviously, but had to be made cinematic. The individual perhaps best at that task in the whole wide world is named Nicholas Hytner. Now, if I was bragging, I can pretend to have discovered Nick, because when I was a young guy working for Sam Goldwyn, I championed him as a first-time director to make the movie adaptation of Alan Bennett's play starring Nigel Hawthorne called The Madness of King George, which Nick had directed on the stage. But in truth, that's BS. I may have helped him a little bit getting his first film made, but Nick was discovered long before that. He was already a titan of the theater. That status, by the way, has only grown. His recent film adaptation of The History Boys continues his excellence, and he is the preeminent theater director and visionary working today. He's the artistic director of the National Theatre in England, which under his command has been ridiculously successful. So let's just put it this way. Between Arthur Miller as screenwriter and Nick Hytner as director, there weren't many dramaturgy issues they couldn't handle. But here, to me, is where their brilliance and the unexpected genius of the movie arises. You see, Miller was smart enough and experienced enough to know that his own underlying work was a play, and that to work as a movie, he couldn't be a slave to it. He had to reinvent it and make it cinematic. Miller himself said, quote, "The movie's something you see, and the play's something you hear, so it's appealing to a different part of the human receptivity. I tried in the adaptation of the play to the screen," he said, "to make it as pictorial as it conceivably could be. And this, in many ways, made it easier to convey the drama." Now, that may seem obvious and self-evident, but you would be surprised how many authors can't make the adjustments to transfer mediums on their own work. In this task, Hytner was a full partner. There are many scenes in the film you're about to see that are only mentioned or suggested in the play, beginning at the outset with the seance in the woods and continuing all the way through to John Proctor's execution. And within all the scenes themselves, for all the power of Miller's words and the very particular language he says he sort of invented for the characters, keep your eye on just how strong the visual storytelling is. See how much the camera tells you about the characters and their feelings. That is the language of film, combined with the poetry of spoken language, and together they make great cinema. With Miller and Hytner in control, and my old friend and mentor, David Picker, perhaps the classiest and wisest movie man I've ever known, brought on to help shepherd, all that remained was the casting. All. Many times on Legacy, we have told you stories about all the many actors who almost did such and such a role, the ones who dropped out, the ones who declined, the ones who were declined. The Crucible is that rarest opposite bird, a film for which the very first and best choice for each of the key roles said yes. Now, there was only ever, in the filmmaker's and the studio's mind, one ideal actor for the moral center of this film. If Daniel Day-Lewis, with his truth, his power, his conviction, his force, had not done John Proctor, I can't imagine who could have.
If she is innocent, why do you never wonder if Paris be innocent, or Putnam, or Abigail? Are the accusers always holy now? Were they born this morning as pure as God's fingers? I'll tell you what's walking Salem vengeance. The little crazy children are jangling the keys of the kingdom and common vengeance rights the law. I'll not give my wife to vengeance!
Joan Allen was nominated for an Academy Award for Elizabeth.
I counted myself so plain, so poorly made that no honest love could come to me. Suspicion kissed you when I did. I never knew how I should say my love.
And of Winona Ryder, clearly one of the greatest actresses of her generation, Arthur Miller told me himself that of all the many great Abigails he had seen do the part for 4 decades, Winona's was the best, the most disquieting, the most frightening, and indeed the truest to human desire.
I never knew what pretense Salem was. It's Christian women and their covenanted men, and all of their boiling in lust. And now you bid me go dead to all you taught me? I know you, John Proctor. You love me. Whatever sin it is, you love me yet.
All that remained was to complete the dream team with Danforth, and for that part, none other than the immortal Paul Scofield. Scofield said that the part felt strangely familiar to him, as it was essentially the flip side of his most famous screen performance as Sir Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. He would win the BAFTA for this role, and Arthur Miller, who turned 80 during the filming and had seen an actor or two during his time, believe me, thought Scofield quite simply, quote, the greatest actor in the English language.
This is a new time, a precise time. We live no longer in the dusky afternoon, when evil mixed itself with good and befuddled the world. Now, by God's grace, the good folk and the evil entirely separate. I hope you will find your place with us.
So, there you have it. The Fantastic Four of actors and dynamic duo of director and writer, and they all go at it with gusto. Try, when you watch it, to put allegory aside and even period aside. Focus instead on our continuing human frailties, lust, guilt, arrogance, pride, and ultimately, honor. Try and let it transport you, and see if, for all its pain and sadness, you are not still, tonight, more than 3 centuries past its setting and half a century after the words were first written, moved and comforted that John Proctor endures. Proctor, who in the end will stand up with the last full measure for what is right and true and will not blacken his name with a lie. And why? Well, because it is my name. Because I cannot have another in my life. I have given you my soul, John Proctor says. Leave me my name. I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you after. The Salem witch trials were, of course, very real. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts was a puritanical society where citizens feared both for their immortal souls and for their land. The local government had recently stripped some residents of their property rights, so no one felt secure. Into this bubbling cauldron of uncertainty, a group of girls were caught in the woods dancing with a slave named Tituba. To avoid punishment, the girls invented the now familiar story that they had been possessed by witches. Under the pious leadership of Judge Danforth and Reverend Parris, 19 people were unjustly hanged for witchcraft. And, strange as it was, they hanged 2 demonic dogs, too. Now, this literal witch hunt provided the perfect parallel to the allegorical witch hunts of 1953. Senator Joseph McCarthy was then amassing power under the pretext of purging communists from the country through his House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was destroying careers in the process. Some people with no communist ties felt compelled to confess their supposed guilt as communists, just as some had confessed to witchcraft nearly 300 years earlier. Some innocent people named names of other innocent people, while a few bravely stood up to the oppression. The only thing that stopped the insanity in both eras was an overreaching of power. The Puritan clergy went unchallenged while attacking the powerless, but when they went after the relatives of government officials, those authority figures swooped in to intervene. Similarly, McCarthy's hearings ended when he started hunting down alleged communists in the U.S. Army. The military responded in kind, accusing McCarthy of cronyism, and public support for him collapsed. By 1954, the year I was born, McCarthy had been censured by the Senate. He died less than 3 years later, likely due to complications from alcoholism. Embracing the parallels between these historical events, Miller traveled to Salem for research. There he discovered the true story of Abigail Williams, the instigator of the witch trials, who had been a servant of John and Elizabeth Proctor. While basing his story on actual events, Miller took significant creative liberties. The real John Proctor was in his 60s and Abigail was only 11. But by making their ages closer together and creating the romantic backstory, Miller gave his version an emotional core. Still, many other elements, including the ultimate fate of Elizabeth Proctor, were all true. And in addition to the Crucible's broad allusions to the communist era, certain elements directly reflected incidents in the author's own life. Miller dedicated the play to his wife, Mary, and many friends interpreted Proctor's apology to Elizabeth for his transgression as Miller's public apology to his wife for his affair with Marilyn Monroe. Furthermore, Proctor's noble refusal to inform on other townsfolk was widely interpreted as Miller's condemnations of the actions of his good friend and previous collaborator, director Elia Kazan, who had directed Death of a Salesman to great glory, and who had recently agreed to name names to McCarthy in order to save his own career. Incidentally, Kazan and Miller would not speak for over a decade after that incident. But, as we said in the open, all those 1950 allegories seemed far away in 1996, and for a time, Arthur Miller himself was thought irrelevant. Of course, upon his passing in 2005, all that rapidly changed again. But I believe that the Crucible as moral drama is permanently relevant. Think for just a minute of the poisonous, partisan, gotcha political climate we live in right now, today, where if the party in power is for it, the party out of power is entirely against it, whatever it may possibly be, and where standing up for Bill of Rights values in any way that suggests the slightest compromise of absolute fidelity to America, right or wrong, results in questioned patriotism. And then consider Judge Danforth's righteous certainty when he says, quote, "You must understand, sir, that a person is either with this court or he must be counted against it. There be no road between." I tell you, that sentiment from authority scares the hell out of me for our country, now as then. Dissent is pure patriotism. Arthur Miller knew that, and the Crucible is a tragic reminder of what happens when it is suppressed. So, the play itself is a tragedy, and the film met a tragic fate at the box office. But all is far from grim. The message is inspiring, and the movie itself led to many wonderful events. First, after 43 long years' wait, Arthur Miller at last got the adaptation he deserved and desired, and the Academy Award nomination to go with it. He also got a son-in-law, and not coincidentally, Daniel Day-Lewis, a wife. Rebecca Miller, now an extremely talented film director in her own right, was working as a still photographer on the movie, and she and Daniel Day-Lewis met on set, fell in love, and married. So John Proctor may have been unlucky in love, but the guy in his costume was not. And last, and certainly least, except in my house, I, a movie and theater geek of the first order, got to know one of my great life heroes, Arthur Miller. And I'll tell you, I tried my best in meetings with him not to think at every minute, wait a second, this guy was actually married to Marilyn Monroe. But come on, how cool was that? For Fox Legacy, I'm Tom Rothman. We'll see you next time.